everyone. My name is Patty Lowe. Buju, Patty Lowe, Indijnakaz, Mashkazibi, and Dojaba, Mang Dodam. I just introduced myself as Patty Lowe, and I told you that I'm from Mashkazibi, which is the Bad River Band of Lake Superior, Ojibwe, and that I am Loon Clan. So thank you so much for joining me this evening. It's really great to be back in Wisconsin, if only virtually. I've been asked to talk about seventh generation earth ethics. That book was based on oral history, songs, dances, basket patterns, wampum beads, powwow regalia, all the ways that Native people reconstruct the past without using print sources. I used a few, but I really privileged non-print sources. And along the way, I met some really amazing people, and I kept thinking, geez, somebody ought to write a book about Walt Brissett, or somebody ought to write a book about Joe Rose. And after that first book, I thought, well, maybe I'll do that, since it doesn't seem like anybody else is doing it. And these are environmental leaders that all of us should know. And so that was sort of the genesis for seventh generation earth ethics. Seventh generation is a principle not unique to the Ojibwe. It exists in Oneida, among the Potawatomi, among quite a few tribes. It may not always be called seventh generation, but it's this notion that this generation is obligated, when it makes decisions, to consider how their actions will affect 7 generations into the future and act in what they believe to be their best interests of our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. There was at one time a move to make seventh generation a US constitutional amendment. And here's basically what the amendment said: the rights of citizens of the United States to use and enjoy air, water, wildlife, and other renewable resources determined by the Congress to be common property shall not be impaired, nor shall such use impair their availability for the use of future generations. So the way I approached it was to assemble one biography from each of the 12 Native communities that I had been working with and collaborating on my other books, and pick those whose life stories spoke to larger community histories. And as I continued into the project, I realized that really environmentalism is too narrow, because everybody in Indian country who lives close to their land is technically an environmentalist. So sustainability might have been a better organizing principle. So I'm not going to talk about every single entry, but there were a couple that I really wanted to highlight. And one of them was Walt Brissett, an amazing activist. He was the co-founder of the Wisconsin Greens Party. He was the community activist who started more than a dozen social justice and community organizations, many of which are still going strong today. He was an author, a communication specialist, and a public relations information officer for Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. Walter was just an absolute amazing man who really became sort of the voice for treaty rights and sovereignty during the spearfishing struggles that some of you may remember. And I really wanted to include him in the book. Franny Vancile was a Mole Lake activist who was really involved in a lot of the mining opposition movements. The Crandon mine especially, you may remember that Exxon had announced a major sulfide, had announced a major gold, silver, zinc find in a sulfide deposit near Crandon, Wisconsin. This would have been in the late 60s, early 70s. And and it was, the plans were altered. Initially, they were closer to the Menominee Reservation. The Menominee and the Oneida really set into movement an opposition campaign to save the Wolf River, which initially the environmental impact statement had the tailings and the water, that the effluent from the mine after it was allegedly going to be cleaned, flowing into a tributary of the Wolf River. And the Wolf carried an outstanding resource waters designation. And so the plan then moved it closer to the Mole Lake Reservation, with the plan to discharge into the Wisconsin River. And this actually was a phrase from the environmental impact statement, that the plan to put the effluent in the Wisconsin River was justified because the solution to pollution is dilution. The Wisconsin River was polluted already, and so what's a little bit more, contamination. And Franny Vancile was really courageous in the effort to keep the mine out of Crandon. And eventually their efforts paid off. And in the mid 2000s, the Mole Lake Ojibwe and the Forest County Potawatomi actually bought the mine site to prevent it from ever being mined. Joe Rose has been my mentor for probably 40 years, an amazing fellow with incredible endurance. He's hospitalized right now, and so I'm putting tobacco down and praying really hard for him. He's an environmental scientist. He's the former director of Native Studies at Northland College and a professor emeritus. He is the Bad River representative on the Void Intertribal Task Force, which basically is charged with safeguarding treaty rights in the ceded territory, another anti-mine activist. And he was one of the leaders in the fight to keep the taconite, Gogabec taconite mine, which was planned in the Pinocchio Hills in the uplands, upriver, the headwaters of our Wild Rice River. And Joe was really active and instrumental in turning back that threat. Hillary Sparky Waka, interesting fellow. When I mentioned that the wolf was protected because it had an outstanding resource waters designation, well, Sparky Waka was one of the main activists who made that happen. And he was also active in opposition to the Wolf River batholith being a possible. It was shortlisted as the repository for nuclear spent nuclear rods, and so it was going to become this nuclear repository. And Sparky Waka was instrumental in heading that threat, keeping that threat at bay. And then he was really active in the fight to prevent the Exxon mine from situating in Crandon. And during the Ojibwe treaty rights, he was literally on his deathbed. He was hospitalized. He had been administered last rites, and he got out of his hospital bed and went to a rally in support of my tribe and the other Ojibwe tribes that were trying to assert their treaty rights and spearfish and gather and hunt and fish in our ceded territories in accordance with the treaties that we had signed in 1837, 42, and 1856. So just an amazing, amazing fellow. Thomas St Germain, who was a Lac du Flambeau Ojibwe attorney, had gone to Carlisle. The reason I included him in the book is because in the 1940s, he actually argued off-reservation Ojibwe treaty rights to the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court. And the case didn't get very far, but it was a pretty courageous thing to do. But in researching him, wow, what a fascinating fellow. He was at Carlisle when Jim Thorpe was there and was on the same football team. Carlisle had an amazing reputation as being this powerhouse sports university. It played, the football team played all of its games away because they were paid to show up and play teams like Harvard and Northwestern and the University of Wisconsin, because people wanted to see this all Indian team. And they were coached by Pop Warner, who was instrumental in popularizing the forward pass. He didn't invent it, but his teams used it along with things like the hidden ball trick. And they were really an entertaining team to watch. And so people showed up to watch them. So they played all their games away, and that was how they paid for the entire athletic budget for all the sports at Carlisle. But Thomas had a problem with women, and he had this. His life story reads like a bodice ripping romance novel, and it was always non-native women that he got involved in, one of whom was the daughter of a very wealthy financier, and daddy found out and didn't want them together. They wound up having a child together. By that time, Thomas St. Germain was involved with yet another woman, another wealthy woman, heiress, and woman number one showed up with their 2-year-old, and he wound up getting thrown in a Chicago jail and did a jailhouse interview with a Chicago Tribune reporter. And eventually the first woman left him. He had just gotten engaged to the second heiress, and when she found out about woman number one and their child, she left him and wound up, I wondered where she had gone to. She was from Davenport. She immediately went back to her family in Davenport and opened up a mahjong parlor in Davenport. And when I checked her census records, she was referring to herself as a widow and had moved to Los Angeles. And I guess she, as far as Thomas was concerned, he was dead to her. But he was very much alive and living with yet another woman that he had gone back to Lac du Flambeau with. So it's a really interesting fellow. Jim Schlender was he wasn't the first director of the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, but he was really the first permanent director and really led that organization, which, it's been compared to the Ojibwe DNR, which is not really correct. Yes, it's a collection of scientists who have fancy degrees at the end of their name, but Glyphwick begins with the research that Glyphwick does is to ask a cultural question and then apply the scientific methods to answer that question. And during the Ojibwe treaty rights legal disputes, I had a really interesting sort of personal connection to this. My husband and I lived outside of Madison. We had a sweat lodge on our 5 acres in the town of Middleton, and there'd been this plan when the U.S. Supreme Court was hearing this treaty rights case. The plan was for runners to run from Mille Lacs, where the lawsuit had originated through the Wisconsin Ojibwe reservations and Michigan reservations. At Lac du Flambeau, they were going to do a sacred fire and a sweat, and then they were going to run through Madison and run all the way to Washington, D.C. Well, there was this blizzard and they couldn't get the fires lit in Lac du Flambeau, and I got a call saying, could we use your sweat lodge? And could a few of the runners stay overnight? Of course, we said yes. Well, a few of the runners wound up to be 42 people in our house. And it was like kind of the loaves and the fishes. People kept showing up with food, and someone showed up, a physician showed up and was treating people who had fatigue and shin splints and blisters. And it was really an amazing experience. And the next morning, we were all outside having breakfast, and I was making pancakes, and Jim came up to me and said something to me, and I thought he asked if they were wheat cakes, and I said no, I thought they were buttermilk pancakes. And he looked at me like I had grown 3 heads and said, what do you think I said to you? And I said, I thought you asked me if these were wheat cakes. And he said, no, I greeted you and said, good morning, isn't it a beautiful day in Ojibwe Moan? You have to learn your language. So I was, of course, chastised. And and one of the things that was really interesting was on our decks, we were all holding, on our back deck, we were all holding hands. And every morning they had prayed and focused the entire day on one particular Supreme Court justice. And on that day, the justice that we all prayed for was Sandra Day O'Connor. And the runners left, continued to Washington, and got there right around Thanksgiving. Actually, I think it was the week of Thanksgiving that the case was actually heard. And fast forward to May, it's now my birthday, and I'm having lunch with one of the attorneys in this case, who's also had a birthday in May. And we were at the Great Dane restaurant and bar on right off the Capitol Square. And Carol's phone rang, and she screamed and got up and started doing a dance. And she said the Supreme Court had just issued its ruling. It had upheld and affirmed Ojibwe treaty rights, and Sandra Day O'Connor, who was the least likely person to vote with the majority because she was an ardent states' rights justice, had voted with the majority. And so I'll always kind of think that maybe that day at my house was special. Oh, and then there's an epilogue to this. About a year later, I got a brown paper package with that had no return address on it. And I opened it up, and it was a towel that you might use in a sweat lodge, a towel, and embroidered on the towel was wheat cakes. So that sort of became my nickname among, with the Glyphwick folks and on my reservation. And it still makes me smile when I think about Jim and Glyphwick. Caroline Andler, who is a Brothertown member, was a tribal genealogist. The Brothertown are not federally recognized, and if you look at the way you get federally recognized, the whole acknowledgement process is really onerous, and you have to produce a lot of documents. And one of them are, of course, the names of the members of your tribe. And the Brothertown had been terminated as a tribe in 1839, a legal process, not an actual physical termination. But in exchange for citizenship, they had agreed to be terminated. And so all those records, they didn't have all those records. And so Carolyn started with her name and her family's name, and over a period of 10 years wound up with 40,000 names. And that was the way her tribe was sustained. And it remains a really central piece of their acknowledgement case, part of the evidence that they're using to try to get their federal acknowledgement back. Wanda McFagan, who is a St. Croix Ojibwe woman, is the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for her tribe. And that area, that St. Croix area, was a really disputed area. There were lots of skirmishes between the Dakota Sioux and the Ojibwe. And there are quite a few graves, sacred sites, and Wanda has taken it upon herself to not just protect the Ojibwe graves, and there's a lot of paperwork that's involved in the whole tribal historic preservation process through the national park system, but she's also doing the same thing for the Dakota remains and items that turn up during highway projects or routine construction projects. Dorothy Davids is one of my favorite people in the world. Spent many decades as a UW Extension outreach specialist, was a Vista volunteer in Chicago, longtime educator, National Congress of American Indians treasurer, a community activist. And she has just an amazing reputation, and she and I were pretty close personal friends. I would spend time staying with her and Ruth Godinez, who is also an educator. And she was telling me about when she was the first person in her community, her native community of the Mohican Nation Stockbridge Munsee Band in Bowler. She was the first Mohican to go to college, and she didn't know anything about how you went about registering for college, but her brother borrowed a car and drove her down to Stevens Point, and she showed up at the Dean of Students office and said, my name is Dorothy Davids, and, I'm here to, I want to go to college. And the dean said, well, do you have your transcripts? And Dorothy, the transcripts, what are, well, a record of your, and no, she didn't have that. Well, do you know your GPA? Dorothy is, my GPA, what do you mean? Your grade point average? No, she didn't know that either. And the woman said, well, did you at least matriculate? And Dorothy said, oh yeah, I did that when I was 14. So she's just, love that story. Bill Golnick, who is Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, was really a critical figure in the Oneida land claims efforts of the 2000 teens. Director of Legislative Affairs for the Oneida, Chief of Staff, and the negotiator for the unsuccessful land claims. This is a story that people do not know about, and they should. During the American Revolution, what some people call the Iroquois Confederacy, which the Oneida and their Confederates they call themselves Haudenosaunee, people building a longhouse. They prefer Six Nations Confederacy, which is the Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, Mohawk, and after during the 1720s, the Tuscarora. So the Confederacy tried to stay neutral during the American Revolution, but ultimately it fractured with the Cayuga, Seneca, Mohawk siding, or elements of their tribes siding with the British, and the Oneida, the Oneida and the Tuscarora sided primarily with the Americans, and the Onondaga tried to stay neutral. Well, after the American Revolution, when these warriors came home, they found that non-native people had moved into their homes and were basically squatting in them, and they complained to the governor of New York, who was a land speculator, and convinced them that the best way, their best deal was to lease the land to him. And he signed treaties with the Oneida. They didn't know that he basically was a land speculator. And he put pressure on the United States to negotiate a treaty with the Menominee and the Ho-Chunk to move the New York Indians into Wisconsin, or what would become Wisconsin. And so this was in clear violation of the US Constitution. If you think about the division of powers, you have the federal government is the entity that is explicitly identified as the government that enters into treaties and specifically treats with Indians. And it's illegal for states to enter into treaties or leases. And the governor of New York had clearly done this. And the Oneida took their case to the US Supreme Court numerous times. And each time the US Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Oneida and told the state of New York, look at, you have, these were illegal treaties, you have to make good on this. And eventually there was a settlement, but the three branches of Oneida, the Wisconsin Oneida, the New York Oneida, and the Oneida that had stayed with the British and fled to Canada during the American Revolution, didn't see eye to eye on the settlement. And at one point, the New York Oneida had made an agreement with the state of New York without consulting the Wisconsin Oneida, and it was, the analogy of you're in a car accident, you're in the back seat, or you're in the front seat and you get injured, and the person in the back seat settles with the insurance company and settles on your behalf. So that was kind of what happened here. And so the Wisconsin Oneida did not want to sign the agreement, and another New York tribe wound up with a land claims suit that went to to a federal court that was much weaker. And the courts there, and ultimately this US Supreme Court, invoked something called laches, which is basically in legalese, if you snooze, you lose. And it said, you haven't been able to assert sovereignty over this area that you've claimed for such a long time. You can't claim it now because it would be disruptive to the non-Oneida that are living in that area. Because at one time, the New York Oneida had issued eviction notices to 26,000 landowners as a way to move the case and get the state of New York to settle. So it was really a disappointing outcome because then the Oneida, there was a precedent, and because the Cayuga case had failed, it was easy enough for the US Supreme Court to say, yep, laches, it took you too long, and so didn't work for the Cayuga and it won't work for you. And one of my disappointments, and I'll tell you, this won't make me a very popular person. I have a great amount of respect for Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Amazing justice, women and children. She did amazing things, but she wrote the opinion in this case against the Oneida, and actually invoked the doctrine of discovery, which, if you know your history, is a papal order that, if you found land that didn't have Christians on it, then you could plant your flag and it was yours. And, I read somewhere later that she said that was one of her biggest regrets in the cases that she ruled on. And so I thought I'd share that. Jenny and Mary Thunder, Forest County, Potawatomi medicine women who treated trachoma and diphtheria and tuberculosis, and delivered babies snowshoeing sometimes, up to 30 miles a day to doctor people in their communities. amazing stories. And it was really heartening to see that the Potawatomi Health Clinic was named in their honor. And Truman Lowe, whose passing last year was really felt in the art world. Truman, Ho-Chunk tribal member, UW-Madison art professor, and someone who did really thoughtful, large installations that really invoked history, environmentalism. I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but in this piece here, you see these, I think these are willow branches, but periodically you'll see these little red beads. This was to remember a smallpox epidemic that hit the Ho-Chunk. I think it was smallpox in about 1905, 1915, somewhere in there. But very soulful art. And he was really an environmentalist and was refused to work in birch because birch bark, because of climate change, birch bark was thinning and trees weren't growing to a maturity that artists could, work with them. And Truman wanted to keep them available to community people who were making winnowing baskets and other sort of functional items with birch bark. Really inspiring fellow. So the one thing that, that every one of these 12 individuals had was this really strong sense of ethics. And I concluded the book by saying, the Native people whose lives are depicted here understood the cultural gravity that kept their people rooted to their ancestral lands and acted in ways that ensured the growth and success of future generations. So I think I'll end there. Thank you very much, and Gigawaba Men Minwa. I hope to see you later.